Hi, this is Jens Soering, and I spent 33 years in prison for a crime I didn't commit. And if that weren't bad enough, after I was released, the media put out documentaries that did not show viewers the whole truth. That happened both on Netflix and on German public TV. And now I'm making the series of YouTube videos to get the record straight by talking to Sheriff Chip Harding, who is now retired, but who investigated this case for 2 years in the late 2010s. And we're going to be talking about a really important piece of evidence in this case, a shoe print found at the crime scene 33 years after the crime. Let me introduce you to Chip Harding. Chip, would you remind viewers a little bit about who you are?
Well, I'm retired. I was sheriff of Albemarle County that surrounds the city of Charlottesville in Virginia for 12 years, the last 12 years of my career. Prior to that, I worked 30 years in the police department overseeing investigations or investigating cases directly. Part of that time, I ran a DEA drug enforcement task force, mainly major conspiracy cases where guys were getting life with no parole. And before that, I was a probation officer doing background investigations on young people that were getting in trouble for the court. So I had many, many years of investigations experience, and not to be bragging, but just so the viewer understands, I've taken hundreds and hundreds of people to court for serious offenses, and I never lost a single case because I feel like I'm very, very thorough in my investigative work.
You got involved in this case originally, believing that I was guilty.
So I knew enough about the case that was presented publicly. It was not much question in my mind that you were in fact guilty. And Stephen Rosenfield was a good attorney, but he's known to have a big heart and to be more of a liberal Democrat. I ran as a conservative Republican to get elected. So conservatives sometimes raise their eyebrows at who they consider to be liberals, as maybe you're a little soft-hearted and just seeing things a certain way. Steve came to me because I'd assisted someone else get exonerated from a murder they did a few years before that. He asked that I review part of your pardon petition to see if I saw any weaknesses or how he could strengthen it. And I asked, well, what's the case? And he said, you. And I said, well, I'll do it, but you're guilty. He said, why do you think? And same reasons I just said. And I read for about an hour, and I called him up and said, man, this is fascinating. This is nothing like the documents he'd put together that was presented in trial. Could you give me more? And he said, I'll load you up. And I came home and spread that stuff on my dining room table. And for 2 days, I hardly left the table reading and underlining. My wife said, what are you doing? She said, you've lost your mind. I said, no, this is just unbelievable what I'm seeing here. You know, it's a real injustice. And I've never liked bullies, and I've never liked injustice. And I didn't put up with it in law enforcement either. You know, I always treated people fairly. And if I had a detective I felt like was fudging the truth and stuff, they were out of there. You know, there's a certain way you got to do it, or the public loses confidence. And when I read this, I went, holy moly.
Yeah.
And that's what got me going on it.
And then you brought in Richard Hudson, who at that time had already retired. You were still active, but Richard Hudson had already retired, and he had been your partner on the Charlottesville Police Department. And I've seen the photographs of the two of you from the late 80s with really tight shirts, all muscled up, when you used to bust down doors. I won't show those photos to the public, Chip. Your secrets are safe with me. But you brought in Richard Hudson. The two of you then came to visit me in prison and interrogated me and tried to trip me up. And then he also started reading all the documents and researching and interviewing witnesses in Virginia. And I'd like for you to tell a little bit about Richard Hudson because he's passed. And I want you to tell a little bit about him and then about what he discovered, because he was your friend for 30 years, right?
Yeah, if not more. He joined the police department about 4 or 5 years after I did and immediately wanted to work on the drug squad. Richard was brilliant, great reputation in law enforcement. And his wife, she just retired a couple of years ago, was brilliant. She was an assistant U.S. attorney and prosecuted federal cases. So a lot of the cases we worked together, they would have discussions at the kitchen table, and particularly concerning legal issues. So I was getting great advice because Richard knew the law better than I did, and his wife knew it better. She studied even at Oxford, so she was brilliant. And the same thing happened on your case. I know they had many discussions about your case.
Of course, we intentionally kept a distance between the two of you and me while I was still in prison so that you could stay objective.
I visited you twice, about 3 hours each time. Once just myself when I got involved. After I wrote my letter to the governor and it hit the news, Richard called me, said, I've read your letter. Wow. Because he knew me. No BS, he knows. And he said, could you use help on this? I said, absolutely. He said, well, I'd like to meet him. I don't want to get to know him. Same reasons. I want to see if I can catch him in a lie. And I said, well, let's do it because I tried. And everything he's told me has even come to fruition as truth or is probably the truth. See, some of the stuff you can't prove. So had only met you once for 3 hours. And when Stan Lapicus, the former FBI agent, joined in, I'd helped him on another case of wrongful conviction. He said he didn't want to meet you at all for those reasons. So the media tries to say you manipulated us. Well, if you did, we're not aware of it. You're doing a hell of a job.
What I was going to say is that after I was released, you and I did a few video calls and telephone calls, but with Richard and me, we used to email a lot before he passed. And once I got to know him a little bit, what I really noticed about Richard is he's a real intellectual. You'd never think it because he looked like a really tough guy, right? He was such an intellectual. And he had like a laser sharp mind. And one of the ways that this came about while I was still in prison is that he actually found a shoe print in a crime scene photograph that absolutely everybody had overlooked for decades. And this is important, this shoe print, as important as it is, did not get included in the Netflix series, and of course also not get included in the German television stuff that gets put out over here. Everybody's ignoring this shoe print. You want to tell us about the shoe print?
The whole thing's kind of crazy because even in your trial, there were shoe prints that were determined by 3 or 4 experts, including Bedford Sheriff's Office, to be that of a woman or a small child. Definitely not in your range, that were much more definitive than that sock print that would have enlarged and had slippage in it. And early on, even there was an affidavit on the first suspect, who was a small female. The Commonwealth attorney did an affidavit saying that to her attorney that she'd hired, if she won't submit her footprints and fingerprints and all, we're going to get a search warrant, and here's the affidavit. And someone in law enforcement would have had to have sworn to that.
Yeah.
That's the size that's similar to hers. Well, that seemed to be all pushed to the wayside at trial.
Let me briefly speak to that. Like what you're just saying, the sock print was smeared and moving, but the shoe print, LR2, was pretty damn clear. And there were other shoe prints made by the same shoe, but LR2, which is the name of this one particular shoe print, is pretty damn clear. And it was determined to be a woman or a small boy, size 8, woman size 8. And of course, Elizabeth had a size 8 shoe size. And that got completely ignored in the trial, just like you said.
It did. And so Richard and I attempted to get as many photographs from a crime scene as possible. Bedford would not cooperate with us at all, would not meet, would not talk about it, shut us down completely. Chuck Reed, who was working with us some, had been one of the original investigators. He would say close to 1,000 photographs or more taken. We only got privy to about 40 of those photographs. Well, Richard and I were sitting in the office going over them for like the 10th time once. And he said, oh my God, look at this. I was right beside him. And look at what? And he said, look at this. There's a different shoe impression. The tread pattern's different in blood. I went, I don't know how I missed seeing that. We've looked at it. Sure enough, absolutely. There's a second shoe impression that's different from the ones that have been talked about through the whole investigation, which made us wonder, well, what else, if we had the other photographs, would there be some clearer ones? Now, what we didn't know is, because we never got to talk to the people that processed the scene, was all the blood dried at the time the scene was processed? Could that have been someone processing the scene, inadvertently stepping that blood or not? But it looked like it was probably, I'd have to add it up, 4 or 5 days from the time they think the murders occurred. So probably that blood was dried.
This is an important point. The murders happened on March 30th, and the crime was discovered on April 3rd, and there's 31 days in March. So we're talking about 5 days in between. What do you think? Is there any possibility at all that some of the blood might have still been wet enough to leave a shoe print, or would that have all been dried up by then?
I think it was somebody that was there at the time the homicides were committed. And I think there could well be other photographs. But see, there was so much intentionally admitted at your trial. It's like Stan Lapika said, this case smells, there's smoke. And we're going to get into this stuff. But when they were absolutely denying that there was a profile done by the FBI early on that indicated it was probably a female close to the family, and they denied that. And then you see that you had Detective Luminol the vehicle and was subpoenaed and set outside because they sequester people, thinking he was going to testify. And they never heard that information. And then the shoe and the sock print, even our own state labs that we rely on, could refute the so-called, well, they didn't allow him to be called an expert in court, but he testified. When you put all that together, and then you read a letter from the prosecutor Updike to Elizabeth Haysom saying, I really enjoy hearing from you, look forward to your letters. And he makes a statement to why he did this is beyond me, but he made a statement to a friend of mine who was a reporter saying that he let her put the case together, that she was of great help. So you didn't have a chance. When all that's going on, I would think, if I was Netflix, that would be my story. That's what's so fascinating. What can happen to you where the general public thinks, and you always hear this, well, a jury of 12 heard the evidence and convicted, so they're guilty. Well, that's not the case all the time. It's certainly not the case in your case. And 2020, which is a national show, spent about 12 hours with Richard and I. They didn't put any of that on. They cut it short. Netflix did the same thing. They just want the sensational. They want to make money on what they're doing. Bottom line.
And what they do is they end up leaving out evidence that speaks to my innocence. And the fact that there's a second shoe print at the crime scene that's different from the one everybody knows about. And that would strongly suggest that there were two perpetrators walking around the crime scene. It's not absolute proof. You cannot ever be 100% sure, but it's very likely two perpetrators walking around the crime scene. And then that completely destroys my confession because I said I was there by myself, and the shoe print is extremely strong evidence. No, there were two people at the crime scene. You want to talk about that?
Well, and I think personally that it's hard to believe that some of the law enforcement and the prosecutor weren't aware of that shoe print, but that hurt the case against you when that's brought up. Same way as the shower in the master bedroom was luminol and lit up like the 4th of July. At least the killer or one of the killers apparently took a shower to get the blood off him. That was never brought up at trial.
Not at all.
Because that contradicts her saying you showed up covered in a sheet from head to toe. Something else that Richard noticed, I'll give him credit. I'll give you credit, bud. He said, look at the swirls where they say someone took their socked feet and was wiping the footprints. And I said, well, I hadn't thought about it. But when you look at the distance of the swirl away, and you can have slippage in blood if you go too far out, he said it appears, I never found where anybody spoke about it, but looking at the photographs of the bedroom, it looks like a white sheet's missing.
Yes.
Looks like it's missing. So it's pure speculation. I'm not saying this is evidence that someone balled that sheet up, put their foot on it, and that would give you a much wider swirl pattern to erase stuff. I get to thinking, well, how did Elizabeth come up with, he showed up in a white sheet covered in blood? Probably her brain was thinking about that white sheet's missing, and I know it was covered in blood. Therefore, I'm going to put it on Jens. That Jens was wearing that sheet, which is total BS.
Because the luminol proves that, the luminol test the car. And of course, Chuck Reed and Ricky Gardner disagree about almost everything, but there's two things they agree about. The first thing they both completely agree about is that Elizabeth and I did not commit the crime together. They agree on that, and they both agree that the luminol test of the car shows that was absolutely no blood in the car. That's the only thing they agree about. This story with the bed sheet cannot be true, but there is a bed sheet that is apparently missing from the bed that would explain the swirls and the blood on the floor. And that, of course, brings us back to the shoe print. If the jury had seen that second shoe print that was never shown at trial, then the jury would have had LR2 and the second shoe print, and that might have created enough reasonable doubt for them to find me not guilty. Because I said in my false confession, I did this by myself, but there's two different shoe prints there. So how do you explain that other than what I was saying, which is that the confession isn't true? It was a made up story.
Right. And it's a shame that we've never had the ability, what he found, because you can see part of it clearly, to try to get a measurement on that. We had never had a chance to look at all the other photographs to see if it's a clear impression, but it's very definitive. It's yet a second shoe print there.
And now for a brief commercial interruption. I fought for justice for 33 years while I was in prison, and I'm still fighting for justice today, after my release, through these videos and through a new pardon petition. There's a method to my madness. In prison, I developed a 7-step program for developing fighting spirit so that I would never, ever, ever give up. Today, I work as a coach, and I teach my clients how to develop that fighting spirit as well. Most of my clients come to me because of issues like career development, toxic relationships, libel, or defamation. But of course, I adapt my program to whatever my clients' needs are. If you're interested in working with me as a coach, please go to my website. I'll check you out there.
But you made a point early on that y'all got all the photographs that we had and all the photographs that were in the courthouse, but not all the photographs that the sheriff's department had. And so there may be photographs in the sheriff's department that might show other samples of that shoe making prints someplace else you never had access to and nobody's giving anybody access to.
That crime scene was actually processed by the Lynchburg Police Department. They had a much more sophisticated unit, and we called Lynchburg, and they checked and said that all of that evidence was turned over to the Bedford Sheriff's Office. So they didn't have any reason to retain it, and Bedford didn't give us access to it.
Well, the way the mindset is now, and this is one of the really unfortunate things, once you're convicted, it's like the reasonable doubt thing no longer applies. You have to prove your innocence.
And Virginia's had a couple fairly notorious cases of false confessions that were provable and that people were exonerated. People have a hard time understanding. They've come up to me after I give talks on a variety of things and go, just don't understand why anybody would confess doing something they didn't do. We know there's been a lot of research done on that. I'm not going to get into that, but there's a lot more false confessions than people realize. You know, the general population doesn't know enough about the justice system to realize how hard it is. You know, once you're found guilty, it's almost impossible at that point. That's why if you get in trouble, you darn sure should have the best representation you can get. There's plenty of people proven guilty of stuff they didn't do. Yeah, the jury's listening. And I guess they got to believe that she says she stayed behind and you open a sheet covered in blood from head to toe and neglect in your confession. And you're supposed to be a smart guy. I don't know, they say you are anyway, that you would have remembered if you had done it, taken a shower after showering, which never came in front of the jury. You would have gone down and got a sheet and rubbed it all in the blood and put it over you and driven back all that distance, knowing you could be stopped by law enforcement. I mean, it's great.
Back then, the speed limit was 55 miles an hour, and this was down tiny little country roads and then Route 29. So this would have been 3.5-hour drive at 55 miles an hour on those tiny little roads and everything else in the dark on a Saturday night when there are lots and lots of police out on the road because it's party night. Saturday night is party night, so there's lots of police on the road, and I'm driving for 3.5 hours, butt ball naked, wrapped in a bloody bed sheet. Nobody's noticing this. Nobody's noticing this, and it's really damn crazy.
When you have something produced like Netflix, you got to walk through it. And they had promised me, the producers, and I think the original producer, from what I understand, it may have been taken out of his hands and the product changed because I wasn't going to be involved in it unless they walked through it. And I said, I would love for you to, because that whole trial was taped, to listen to Updike's argument, stop the tape, and let's show you through evidence and let anybody challenge that wants to. And if they did it that way, unless you're a total idiot, 100% of the people would say not guilty. Now, does that mean you absolutely couldn't have done the murder? Of course not. But it doesn't mean I couldn't have done the murder, you know, because I'm of age, I could have been down there. It means that it doesn't meet the standard of guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In this case, meet that standard, and you should not be called a murderer.
Another thing that didn't come out in the Netflix series is that press conference on April the 18th, 2018, where you and Richard Hudson, your former partner in the Charlottesville Police Department, who ended up being a detective sergeant and highly decorated, FBI agent Stan Lapicus, and Chuck Reed, the original senior investigator on this case, the four of you stood there together as a group and asked the governor to grant me an absolute pardon. And like, that's not in the Netflix series. That's
Great.
I've got the video. I'm going to link it up when this is released. I've got the video. It's available on the internet. It's on Facebook. The whole press conference, 1 hour press conference, the entire video is in the internet. So they could have that. They could have used it.
And the four, I don't know Chuck nearly as well as I do. Sam lives in my neighborhood. And of course, Richard and I worked together for almost 30 years. But I can tell you, we're kind of viewed as hard asses. And we locked up a lot of bad people. We're not about letting someone get off on something they did. And I made it very clear to Rosenfield, as did Richard. We weren't working for you or Rosenfield. We were pro bono. We developed, we never received a dime or asked for anything in it. You know, we're not like a lot of people writing a book or have a podcast or any way to benefit financially. But we got enthralled with the case because of what we thought was a miscarriage of justice. And it prevails to this day. And Netflix just, I don't know, 6-7 million people saw it. So as I've told you, I don't think you'll ever get that ship corrected.
No.
Not as many people will view that as your podcast.
But I have to try it. I have to try it. And now the truth is out there, and people who do want to know what you think, because you know that didn't come out clearly in the Netflix series. They find out about Richard and Stan, and I'm talking to Chuck as well. We're going to do one of these as well. None of this was in the Netflix series, or of course on German public TV. And the funny thing is that not in the United States, but here in Germany, I'm being accused of manipulating the media. And that is so ridiculous, because it seems to me, if the media are leaving out all of this evidence and they're leaving out all of these cops who think I'm innocent, then it's actually the media who are manipulating the viewers.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree.
That's a damn shame, and it's not right. And that's why I'm so grateful for you that you're making this video with me. So let's wrap up this first video on that note. Thank you so much, Chip.